Any more comments or questions? Yes.
Two questions. First, where are you getting that 19 out of 20 people died, as a Old Testament? And second of all, finally, how do you know that they were murdered as opposed to they died because of some kind of disease or something like that?
Okay, where do I get the 19 and the 20, and why do I assume that they were murdered? Okay, if there was no murder or other significant cause of death, like some kind of vast plague, then the population should be in the billions in just a few hundred years. In order to keep the population as low as what the archaeological evidence indicates, you have to have widespread death taking place. And so that's where you get the 19 and the 20. If you want to see the calculations, I've got them here. We kind of give you a timeline of how many people you get in the 50-year segments. And what you need to do in terms of killing people off in order to keep the numbers low. So that's where you get the 19 and the 20 minimum. As to why I assume it was murder as opposed to some vast disease taking place, well, the text doesn't mention disease, but it does mention profound evil on the part of humanity, evil to such a degree that it was threatening to exterminate humanity. Well, about the only thing you can imagine that would be a threat to the survival of the human species would be widespread murder. And the fact that it's identified as evil, God never addresses disease in that context. So that's the basis for the conclusion. Okay, you had a question down here? Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for coming.
All right. Thank you.
Your discussion concerning spirit and soul, in common language, I have trouble keeping true to a theological definition. And if you would briefly, for my own benefit.
Yeah, it's more complicated than what you described. The reason why it's more complicated is that you've got the Greek New Testament referring to soul and spirit, and you've got the Hebrew Old Testament referring to soul and spirit, and the definitions are not the same. So it is a little more complicated, but I'm basing my statements on the Hebrew rather than the Greek. So yeah, you can get confused if you're trying to integrate it with the New Testament. And the difference is this, is that in the Hebrew language, there really is a fairly sharp distinction between soul and spirit that you don't see in the Greek or the English. In our English language, we tend to see them as interchangeable terms. But in the Hebrew language, not so. They're distinct terms. So the soulishness of a creature refers to our relational capacities at the level of mind, will, and emotions. So refer to those species of life where we can develop some kind of emotional relationship with them, and where we're able to instruct these species and to do things at our bidding. You can't do that with cockroaches and mosquitoes. No matter how diligently you try to train them to obey your commands, it really won't work unless you're trying to command them to eat something they want to eat anyway. But it's different with the birds and the mammals. And more than that, we can really experience some kind of emotional pleasure in our relationship with them, which is not possible with the reptiles, the amphibians, insects, etc.
Does that have anything to do with the Jewish view of if there is an afterlife or not?
No, but it has a lot to do with the Jewish view of sacrifice. They would sacrifice those animals that had some meaning for them, where they would really sense a tremendous amount of loss through their having to destroy that creature. So you could say that's why they were sacrificing birds and mammals as opposed to snakes and insects. It had more meaning for them. Yes?
A lot of your discussion is based on the interpretation of the inadequacy of the Hebrew language back in that time. The ability to describe.
I don't mean to demean the Hebrew language. I'll tell you where it's very rich compared to English in its verbs. For example, I made reference in Genesis 8 how in the English translation you have just one verb coming through, verse after verse, and that's the verb recede. Whereas in the original Hebrew you got 4 different verbs to describe God's processes of removing the water. And I would wish that the English translation would do the original justice there. And one theologian put it this way: the Hebrew language is a great tool for communicating action. The Greek language is a great tool for communicating abstract doctrine. And indeed, the focus of the New Testament is abstract doctrine. The focus of the Old Testament is action. The problem is we English readers are trying to read this account of the flood and draw out all this geophysical data from it. And there we need to appreciate that in order to correctly interpret the geophysics of the flood, we need to put it in the context of God's judgment. So when I speak on the Genesis flood to, say, a department of geology, what I tell the professors there is, first give me 20 minutes to speak about judgment, and then we'll talk about the geology and the geophysics. Because the geophysics is a byproduct of the action theme of God communicating why He judges the way He does.
My question was whether there are other workers in the field that have also interpreted in the same way that you have.
Yeah, for centuries. I'm kind of a lone...
Current works that are available?
Not many current works. I mean, I have lots of company from more ancient Christian scholars than I do from modern Christian scholars. So, why is that? Because our 20th century context is so different. We're global citizens, for example. And we are citizens where the English language reigns supreme in terms of Bible translations. I mean, what other language has 16 credible translations? And we seem to be on top of the pile. So I think those are factors that need to be taken into account. Also, I see in the English-speaking Christian communities a trend in this century towards anti-intellectualism and anti-science. I think that's played into these controversies more so than, say, the German or the Russian church. And when I speak overseas, I can see the difference. It's just like night and day. Yes.
This trend, did you say, mainly in the American church or in the English-speaking church, or what?
Well, these kinds of controversies I'm speaking about today, they're predominant in America, more so in Australia, to a lesser degree in Canada. But what I find amazing is it's always English-speaking countries. With one exception, that might be Japan, but the church in Japan is so tiny, I mean, maybe it really isn't as big of an issue as we think. Yes? Okay, why is man's lifespan shorter today? I've got a chart here which explains what you got to do if you want to live a really long time. And I guess this is pertinent to Americans because we're always trying to increase our lifespan. But if you want to live a long time, you need a vegetarian diet. Now what's interesting is we see that mankind was commanded to restrain his food intake to vegetable matter until after the flood. When the flood was over, God told Noah, you can eat meat. Why? Because you're not going to live long enough for it to make any difference. Whereas before the flood, they were going to live long enough for it to make a difference. So I'm not encouraging a vegetarian diet. If you're only going to live 120 years, it really doesn't make any difference. But after 500 or 600 years, you will accumulate too many heavy metals from a meat diet. You need some protection from ultraviolet radiation, but that's not a very big factor. You can wear a hat. You don't need sunscreen. A hat will do the job just as well. I mention that because this is often a common explanation you see in the Bible commentaries as to why people lived longer in the days before the flood. They claim that God supernaturally, through some kind of canopy, blocked out ultraviolet radiation. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Chemical carcinogens would be a big factor, but Dow Chemical wasn't in operation back then, so I don't think they had to worry about that. Disease was an issue someone brought up here. But what we notice in medical records is that disease seems to be something that increases as humanity ages rather than the other way around. So there's a good reason to believe that disease wasn't as big a factor back in those days as it was for us. Number 5, I think, is very significant. Identified murder is a big factor. But a 6th factor that could play a very significant